Children, you in grades K through 5 are dismissed. And go here with Kelly. Make your way out. Awesome. Man, good crowd this morning. All right. This morning I was coming in to the sanctuary this morning and someone caught me out of first service and they said, "Pastor, good message this morning." I said, "Thank you." They said, "It was much better than last week." Wow, I didn't quite know how to take that. This morning we are in this series on the book of Ruth, and if you have not been with us and you just kind of pick the story up here at the very end, you might be a little confused. So what I'd like to do this morning as we begin is kind of walk through the story a little bit this morning so we can kind of all get up to speed. So you might have heard some of this before, but I think it'll help everybody get up to speed on where we are in this story of Ruth. We've been in this book since October the 6th, so the first Sunday in October. We're working through, we're kind of coming toward the end of the sermon. Next week, we're going to have something kind of new and different next week. Matt and Doug and I will all three be up here, and we'll be doing some questions about the book of Ruth and kind of looking back over the series and talking about that a little bit. So that's what's going to be happening next week. And then 2 weeks from now, we will be in a combined service at this same hour on the Sunday before Thanksgiving. Don't forget your covered dish that day because we're going to eat dinner or lunch together downstairs afterwards. But on that day, we're going to have a special kind of dramatic reading of the book of Ruth. So we've been doing some different things with Ruth, so we're not done yet. But this morning, I want to kind of just walk through the story just a bit this morning. You might remember, Ruth is David's great-grandmother, okay? So this is the story of King David and his line, and we also know the line of Jesus, right? Because Jesus is an ancestor of David. But the story does not begin with Ruth. It begins with another woman named Naomi, exactly. And I told you early that the story is really more about Naomi than it is Ruth, right? It begins with Naomi and it ends with Naomi. So we have Naomi. She is living in this place called Bethlehem. We remember that town, don't we? And she's living many years before Jesus in this place, and a famine hits the land. And so she and her husband are required to leave in order to survive. They go to this place called Moab. And one bad thing after another happens to Naomi. First of all, her husband dies. That's bad enough, right? She's a single mom with 2 boys. We don't know exactly how old they are, but they seem to be fairly young because later on they get married to Moabite women. That would have been tough for her to swallow, right, as an Israelite, for her kids to be marrying foreigners. But even worse, the Moabite women that her sons marry are unable to bear children, which is a big deal in this culture, right? Your whole worth, your whole lineage is held up in the fact that you have to have a son, and they're not having any kids. And then, to make matters even worse, her 2 sons die. Naomi felt like she was cursed by God. Rightly so, don't you think? Many others probably thought she was cursed by God. Finally, things get better in this town of Bethlehem, so she decides to return to her homeland. And her daughter-in-laws are going with her, but somewhere along the way, she says to them, "No, you guys need to go back home because you got a better chance of finding a husband in your home country." And one of them, named Orpah, goes back, but Ruth clings to Naomi. She sticks with her. She goes with her back to Bethlehem, even though the risk of her never getting married is pretty high if she goes to Bethlehem. But she goes anyways. They get back to Bethlehem and they have to survive. So Ruth decides that she will participate in the welfare system of the day. So she goes to glean in a field. And it's not just any field, not just any ordinary field. It is the field of this guy named Boaz. And he gives her a special place in the field. She gives her gifts of a grain to take home to Naomi. And Naomi kind of sees that this guy is treating her pretty well. And so Naomi says, "Hey, I got a plan. Why don't you go down to the threshing floor and why don't you propose marriage to this man? And then he'll marry you and he'll care for you and you will be taken care of," okay? But Ruth goes down to the threshing floor and she asks Boaz to be a kinsman redeemer. So we're going to discover a little bit later, it's kind of stepping it up a notch. Takes an incredible risk in doing that. And Boaz says, wait, I can't do it because there's someone else in line. Last week, you might remember, we traveled with Boaz to the city gate to have this matter kind of settled. And Boaz says to the other guy, Mr. No Name, will you do it? He says, I'll do it. Then he says, well, you also have to marry Ruth if you're going to do it. And he goes, I can't do it, right? He backs away. Boaz is willing to pay the price. Boaz is willing to invest himself in this redemption, in this rescue of Elimelech's line. And so that's where we left off last week. And you might remember in the scripture we read last week, the town elders in verse 11 saying, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Then they pray for Ruth's womb to be opened in verse 12. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Now, it's kind of interesting, I think, that they mention this Tamar and Perez here in the blessing, because Tamar is kind of considered the mother of the city, okay? All of the people there are descendants of Tamar and Perez, and Tamar has a lot in common with Ruth. Do you remember her story? Ruth and Tamar are both widowed. Tamar and Ruth are both foreigners. Tamar and Ruth both go to extreme measures to rescue the line of their husbands. So it's kind of ironic, I don't know, but they're saying, may you be like Tamar, they say. And then they say, may your name be famous, okay? Now we know what's going to happen. I would say her name's famous, wouldn't you say? So we're several thousand years later still talking about her, right? So I guess their prayer was answered there. Well, today we're going to pick up with verse 13. Ruth chapter 4, verse 13 through 17. And this morning, we're just going to jump right into the text this morning. We're not going to have someone read it. We're just going to go right into it. So let me invite you to open your Bibles to Ruth chapter 4 if you have one. If you don't have one, there's probably one in the pew in front of you. You can open that up to Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. And we're going to, this morning, just kind of work through this text together. We begin in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Good story, right? I mean, do you remember Ruth at the very beginning? She was a foreigner coming into the land. And if we go back to chapter 2, we see Ruth as being less than a servant. You remember that? May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said, for you've given me comfort and have spoken kindly to me, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls. That's where Ruth is in the beginning of the story. We move on to chapter 3, and Ruth kind of ups herself a little bit here in this statement. She says, who are you? She said, who are you? He asked. I am your servant, Ruth. So she's less than a servant. Then she is equivalent to a servant. But here in chapter 4, she is his what? Wife. So she's making her way. Now, that's pretty cool, isn't it? And if we just kind of ended the story right there, it'd be a pretty cool ending. Pretty cool story, wouldn't it? Ruth and Naomi are not going to starve to death, okay? Ruth and Naomi have been rescued. Ruth is not going to have to live gleaning for the rest of her life. She is now Boaz's wife. And in many ways, it's like a Cinderella story, isn't it? You know, the poor becomes rich. The person who's kind of in this low position is raised to a high position. So if we ended the story there, it would be a good story. But the story does not end there. Look at verse 13. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Now, do you remember the prayer of the elders? He prayed that Ruth would be like Rachel and Leah. Rachel, was also barren, just like Ruth, right? So the prayers have been answered here. Ruth has conceived a son. Now, you might ask the question, well, how Ruth was barren before, and now she's conceiving. Well, it was probably her husband's fault, right? And now she's with Boaz, and Boaz is able to produce children, and so she conceives. Well, we don't know that for sure. But you know what? It really doesn't matter, does it? Because the author of Ruth understands conception always as a miracle, doesn't he? And so he says, what? The Lord enabled Ruth to conceive. So however that happens, whether she was infertile, unable to bear a child, and God miraculously turns that around, or whether it was her husband who was incapable and now Boaz is capable, we don't know, and it doesn't matter. But the Lord is credited with the birth of the son. Now again, this is like a Cinderella story, isn't it? Now the poor, below the status of servant girl becomes the wife, and now she has a child. And if the story ended right here, it would still be a good story, wouldn't it? We'd have Ruth and Boaz riding off into the distance, right? With a baby carriage. And life is good, and we could stop right here, and we could say, and they lived happily ever after, right? And that would be a good ending. But that's not the ending, is it? We have to keep going, and we have to see how it's going to end here. The story that we read here is not a Disney movie, okay? It's not handsome Boaz and beautiful Ruth married and walking off into the sunset. That is not how the story ends. We continue to read this morning in verse 14. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." You see, the story doesn't end with Ruth and Boaz, does it? It ends with Naomi. And scholars tell us that this book, this story, is a chiasm. A chiasm is where it begins one way and it ends in the same way. The story of Naomi is kind of a bookend on the story. It begins with Naomi and it ends with Naomi. It begins with Naomi and everything is bad for her, right, in the beginning. And it ends with rejoicing and new birth for Naomi. You might remember in the beginning Naomi's life unravels. In the end, it is put back together again. In the beginning, Naomi is unplugged from her culture, right? She's traveling off to Moab. In the end, Naomi is plugged into her culture with women surrounding her back in her hometown again. In the beginning, Naomi loses her family. In the end, Naomi gains a family. In the beginning, Naomi cries out to God with no answer. In the end, God has answered her prayers. Provision in the new baby. I think we have to be careful here, though, that we don't turn this into like a divine balance sheet, that whatever God takes away, he has to get back, because it doesn't always work out that way, does it? And I would also say that everything that God is giving Naomi in the end, it doesn't make up for what was lost, does it? Don't you think she still grieved for her husband? Don't you think there was still pain there from the sons that she lost? You see, God's not just making it like a balance sheet. Okay, you're good now, Naomi. But it's a story of redemption, isn't it? It's a story of rescue. It's a story of God taking the dark and making light. It's a story of God turning things around. That's what the story is about here. So the story does not end with Boaz and Ruth. It ends speaking of Naomi. And we also see here, the story ends with the son, Obed. Now, you might think, well, Ruth's married to Boaz now. They have Obed. If Boaz dies, Obed will take care of Ruth. and again, they will live happily ever after. But that's not exactly how it works out. You see, many times we picture Ruth and Boaz from an American perspective, don't we? In our culture, they get married, they have a baby, they build a house, whatever else. But that's not how it worked in this culture. And if we want to truly understand this story, if we want to gain the full weight of this story, we have to look at it through the ancient mindset. We have to look at it in the culture in which it was written. Custis James, in her earlier book that I mentioned to you, or this book that I mentioned to you, The Gospel of Ruth, I mentioned it earlier on, says this about the story. Boaz and Ruth aren't starting a family in the typical way we think of today. They're rescuing a family. And there's a big difference. It's a key point here, and we're going to land on that this morning. The author of Ruth wants us to see this. And so this is why Naomi is the one holding the baby at the end of the story. And if we want to get the impact of the story, we've got to go back to the beginning of the story. Naomi and Ruth, at the very beginning of the story, have everything against them. Their lives are in shambles. They're suffering loss, the loss of their family. They're living in poverty. Things do not look good for them. It's also worth noting, if you go back to the very beginning of the story, it opens up in the dark days of the judges, okay? You see, this is a dark place that they began, but it turns around. And the story is about God rescuing these two women. And how does He rescue them? He rescues them through their sacrifice. Through their selfless sacrifice. He begins to turn their world around. Now, it's interesting to note also, and Doug pointed this out in his sermon, God is talking, or the story is about two women here. Do you notice that? The least in society. The least in this culture. They've got no rights. They've got no ability to earn an income in their culture. They've got no way to redeem their family. They cannot do it. And in this final scene, we have Naomi, and she is surrounded by women, and they are celebrating what God has done. Now, Boaz did his part. I'm not saying we should exclude him from the story, but he's not the key character in the story here. He certainly sacrificed, as we talked about a few weeks ago. He certainly stepped up to the plate and did what God was calling him to do. But again, the story is about Naomi, and the story is about Ruth. So that's kind of where it focuses. This last scene is on Naomi and Ruth. Look at verse 15. They say to Naomi, "For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Now, 7 is the perfect number in Hebrew, okay? So what are the women saying here? Ruth is better than the perfect number of sons. She's given birth, and now you, Naomi, have a child. God has honored Ruth's self-sacrifice. God has rescued this family, and the birth of Obed isn't the only point in the story where God comes through. God's coming through the whole time, isn't He? In the very beginning, when they travel back, God is turning things around. When Ruth ends up in Boaz's field, God is turning things around. On the threshing floor that night, God is turning things around. At the city gate, God is turning things around. And now at the very end of the story, we've got the birth of the baby, and God is turning things around. That is the point of the story this morning. God is working, God is providing, God is saving this family. And that's what we see here as the story ends. And it's worth noting here that Obed, the baby, is not considered Ruth's son. She is considered Naomi's son. So even in that, Ruth is offering her son. She's still sacrificing here. Now, I don't know about you, but I think of Ruth, and I think, she's been through a lot, hasn't she? She lost her husband very young. She leaves her family, leaves her homeland. She travels with Naomi, and now God is turning things around for her, and she has a husband, and she has a new baby. Don't you think Ruth deserves a break? Don't you think she should just be able to build a house, settle down with her new husband, and raise her family? Right? But that's not what happens here. Ruth volunteered to be a surrogate mother for Naomi. Ruth understood what she was doing here. Ruth understood that the part of this kinsman redeemer deal would mean that her son would carry on the name of Elimelech, that her son would be Naomi's son. And most scholars believe that Naomi was the one who would have raised Obed. So Ruth is still giving up here. Ruth is still sacrificing, even to the very end here. Now we see the end of the story. Ruth is stepping up and she is offering her son, as she should, to Naomi as her son. Now, in our culture, we have a hard time wrapping our minds around that, don't we? We think, well, what was the deal? Did Ruth still have any impact in the lives of the child? Some scholars believe that Ruth may have continued to live with Naomi and helped her raise the child, but that it was considered Naomi's child. Ruth is laying herself down, and this is good news in the story, isn't it? It's gospel in the story. We continue to see that. And ultimately, we're seeing God not only turning things around for these two women, but He's also turning things around for the world, isn't He? Because He's providing salvation not only for Ruth and Naomi, but through the line of this baby, salvation will come to you and me. And that's a part of this story here. The women say in verse 16, "Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. The women living there said, 'Naomi has a son.'" Do you see it? Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. It seems that Naomi is the primary caregiver for young Obed. Can you imagine his early formative years growing up with Naomi? Do you think he heard the story of Ruth? Do you think he was told by Naomi as he went to bed, as she tucked him in at night, "You know, let me tell you about this trip I took from Bethlehem to Moab. Let me tell you about how bad life was for me. Let me tell you about Ruth and how she stepped up and how she made the trip with me. Your Aunt Orpah, she stayed home. But Ruth, she came with me. Let me tell you," maybe when he's old enough, "about what she did on the threshing floor," right? Going down and risking it all in order to redeem this line. You see, Obed grew up hearing the story from Naomi. And you have to wonder if Obed, as an old man, had young David sitting on his lap, you think? And he was telling him the story of how self-sacrifice was a part of redemption, of how giving up, that's when God stepped in and brought salvation, brought rescue. You see, young Obed would grow up in the arms of Naomi. And the actions of Ruth and the action of Boaz wasn't just so that Ruth and Boaz could be happily married and live happily ever after. It was about salvation. It was about redemption. And that's what's going on here. This morning, as we think about the story and as we reflect back on this part of the story, we often, and I confess, I've been and studied Ruth many times, and we walk away thinking of Ruth as a Disney movie, don't we? We think of the beautiful Ruth and the handsome Boaz. We think of romance and risk and tension. And I got to be honest with you, it makes for a good story, doesn't it? And many times that's just where we land on the story. That was a nice story. We say. We smile and we treat it as we do, like any kind of romance book or movie. But the story is not about romance. The story is about redemption. And that's what we see at the end here. The story is about God bringing these two women, and through their self-sacrifice, bringing redemption to their family, but ultimately bringing redemption and salvation to the world. You see, this story is not just about Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. It's about God, and it's about His redeeming the world, you see. And how does He do it? He does it through giving up. He does it through self-sacrifice. sacrifice. And that is what we see here in the story. And as we read this story, I don't know about you, but I'm challenged by this story. I'm challenged in my own self-interest, my own self-agenda. And I got to be honest with you, when I think about the story, and I think about Ruth leaving her homeland, traveling with Naomi, I got to tell you, I would have gone back to Moab. Maybe you would have said the same thing, right? I would have said, life's not going to be too good for me there. And I think Moab's where I'm going to find a husband and have a better future. And I'm going to go to Moab. I think if I were Ruth, when Naomi said, go to the threshing floor and ask Boaz to marry me, I think I would have just left it at that and thought, hey, I'll just ask him to marry me. There won't be any risk involved there. And we don't have to fool with this kinsman redeemer deal. And if I get pregnant, I won't have to give up my son. And all of that dynamic. But Ruth didn't do that, did she? She gave up. She risked it all. And how did she do it? She did it out of love. Love. She gave up, and through her self-sacrifice, we find redemption. Ruth is risky. She's courageous. She's more concerned about the other rather than herself, even to the point of volunteering to be a surrogate mother for Naomi because she loved her. That word love we see a lot in Scripture, don't we? We read it in the New Testament. John writes to us in John chapter 3, verse 16, "For God so loved the world that He did what? That He gave His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have eternal life." We can't read the book of Ruth without understanding that it is really the story of God, isn't it? It is a story of salvation. It's the story of Jesus, the gospel, the good news in Ruth. Ruth is about rescue. Again, it's not just a love story about Ruth and Boaz. It's a love story about God and His people. And you and I are in that story. And because of Ruth's love for Naomi, God grants a son. A son that will carry on the family name and will make the lineage will make its way to another baby born in Bethlehem many years later. Look at these two verses. Verse 16 in Ruth chapter 4, Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and cared for him. And then many years later we read of Mary. She gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger. You see, these two stories are connected, aren't they? This is the family story. This is the family album of what God is doing throughout all of history. And redemption comes through the baby. Isn't it kind of cool to picture the baby, the image of a baby? I'm going to ask you to go ahead and put that next slide up, Larry. As you look at this baby's face this morning, think about babies. Babies remind us of new life, don't they? And even as a congregation, we're watching lots of babies come around, aren't we? Isn't it cool to see how God is renewing our congregation? And I think that the babies are reminding us that He is renewing our congregation. A nursery that was empty a few years ago is filled almost every week now because of babies. And it's a reminder to each one of us that God is redeeming this congregation. And as we think about babies, we're reminded that we serve a God who redeems, a God who rescues. Well, what about us? Where do we fit into this story? Maybe this morning, God would be prompting some of us to participate in His story. You know, I think of Ruth and Orpah. I mean, the contrast of the two of those. On the road there, again, we don't know how far they were between Moab and Bethlehem. Orpah opts out of the story, doesn't she? She said, she's done. We don't see her again. We don't know what happens to her. We don't know if she gets married. We don't know if she gets killed on the way back to Moab. We don't know anything about Orpah anymore, do we? Because she opted out of the story. But Ruth joins the story of God, doesn't she? And how does she join? She joins by laying it all down, by giving up. through self-sacrifice. And maybe this morning God would be prompting some of us to join His story this morning. And when we join His story, let me warn you, you don't join it by holding on to things. You only join it by letting go of things. And maybe this morning God would be prompting you to let go of something, to release your own agenda so that you can be a part of His story. Only when we let go, only when we allow God to do His work does true redemption take place. Redemption does not come when we hold on to our selfish agendas. May we experience redemption this morning as we let go, as we let God take over. Certainly the story applies to each one of us. We're reminded that God is a God of rescue, that He's turning things around. But I think that the story also applies to us as a congregation this morning, doesn't it? There are implications for us as a church this morning because God is rescuing First Baptist Church Muncie. He's doing incredible things in our midst. He's bringing new life to a dying church. May we continue to allow Him to create new life in us. Being careful not to hold too tightly to our own agendas. May we be open to the movement of His Spirit among us, prompting us at times out of our comfort zones in order to join Him in His mission. May we be a congregation like Ruth, letting go of our own agenda, saying, God, take me wherever you want to take me. If we die, I'm going with you. Where you go, I'll go. Your God will be my God. Whatever happens, I'm with you. May we be a congregation like Ruth. So personally, it applies to us. Collectively, it applies to us. And the face of a baby reminds us that God is creating new life among us. We're going to take a minute here. As the band comes, we're going to sing a song this morning together. And during this song, if there's a decision that you would like to make, you're invited to come. Maybe some of you want to just come and pray for our church this morning. Maybe some of you want to come and pray for something that God is doing in your own heart this morning. Maybe God's tugging on you in a particular way and you need to respond this morning. Maybe you need to join this church. Now would be the time that you would come. So let's all stand together and sing together this morning.